Well, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Werner. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I'm also a partner in the law firm of Holland & Knight. And welcome to our panel discussion about reimbursement issues. A couple of things I want to mention is that so last year we did a panel on reimbursement issues, and the reason this is the first panel that we're doing in the meeting is because we got so many evaluations back from attendees saying that they really wanted to have this conversation early in the conference because it really influences all the other conversations about regulatory or commercialization strategy or what have you. So, you spoke, we listened, and so we're here to do it first. The second thing I want to mention is that other than the first 5 minutes here when I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and give a 30-second narration of their biography, this is going to be an interactive conversation. What we're going to do is we're actually, rather than have it be just kind of in a vacuum, I created a fact scenario, kind of a case study, which I will read when we start. It's not very long. But just to provide a little context for the conversations we can have here. So we're going to have a little bit, I'll tell you what the case study, the fact scenario, and then I'm going to ask the panelists some questions. You'll see that we have a diverse group of folks with varying experiences, so the roles they will play is essentially the ones they play in their professional life. And I also want to make it clear that to the extent that anybody in the audience has any questions while we go, or I'll leave time at the end, but even while we go, please raise your hand. This really is, as I say, meant to be interactive amongst the panelists, as well as with the audience. And for the panelists, you guys should also feel free if you have some comments to make after your colleagues speak. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to go down and talk a little bit about who they are and their expertise. I want to also mention that Teresa has joined the panel, which we very much appreciate her stepping in this morning. And you will see she's the chair of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine Reimbursement Committee and is expert in this, so it's great that she's here. And why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you, Michael. Good morning. My name is Teresa Dixon. I'm currently the Vice President of Government Affairs and Health Economics for Shire Regenerative Medicine. My background or my responsibilities right now are overseeing our product pipelines, coding coverage and reimbursement, alliance management, lobbying, all the things that come into play whenever you're trying to launch or keep reimbursement for our product line. My background is previously I was with Covance Health Economics and Outcomes Services. We had the distinct pleasure of having the acronym of CHAOS, which I think is kind of funny and is a nice representation of the area. I was also with Smith & Nephew for about 6 years, also representing one of our core products, Dermagraft, and also consulting with the orthopedics division. And prior to that, I was with Express Scripts. So it's nice to meet you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Gil Van Brocklin. I am chairman and CEO of Athersys. We're an Ohio-based biotechnology company that has a pretty heavy emphasis in regenerative medicine. One of my colleagues, Dr. Bob Deans, who's our executive VP of regenerative medicine, will actually be doing a presentation tomorrow to talk about some of our exciting clinical programs on that. So I'll save that for Bob. Just my background, in addition to my day job at Athersys, I'm privileged to serve for the past couple of years as chairman of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, which in many ways represents the collective voice for companies and innovators in the field of regenerative medicine that are trying to advance new forms of therapy, whether it's cell-based therapies or non-cell-based therapies, tissue engineering-based approaches, in a safe, ethical, and practical way. And we think all the time about issues that relate to the regulatory issues, the reimbursement issues, and I'm proud that the organization is actually having such a significant impact, and we'll have a chance to talk about that, I'm sure, as well. Just in terms of my training, I did my doctoral work at Stanford Medical School, where I got my PhD in genetics. I also have degrees in economics and molecular biology from University of California, Berkeley. So all my Stanford friends hate me because I went to Cal. All my Cal friends hate me because I went to Stanford. So.
Hi, I'm Steve Crawford. I'm the medical director for the LifeSource Transplant Network at Cigna Healthcare. So my job is multifold. One of the reasons I'm here is that I sit on the Cigna's Medical Technology Assessment Committee, the MTAC, which makes the decisions about what new and existing technologies are going to be covered by for Cigna Healthcare. My background is spent the first half of my career after training in pulmonary critical care in the University of Washington as the critical care director at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. So the first half of my career I dealt exclusively with bone marrow transplant patients and had to learn to interpret what the oncologists and hematologists were saying. So I learned to be a reasonable interface between that side of medicine and the real clinical application in the critical care unit. So I currently also do a number of things with Richard that he'll tell you about regarding the ASBMT and the CIBMTR and all of those other acronyms.
Richard?
Yeah. So I'm Rich Maziers. I'm from Oregon. I run the bone marrow transplant program. And to Gil, Stanford and Cal both are going to lose to Oregon in the next 3 weeks in football. We'll just make that clear. I've been in the field of stem cell transplant for 30 years. I've had a basic lab that's continued throughout time. I've run and I moved to Oregon 20 years ago to set up the bone marrow transplant program. I got into health policy in Oregon, where with the Oregon Health Plan, which is a Medicaid program, which is evidence-based, I was involved with the first discussions about, how you use evidence-based medicine to pay for expensive therapies, and basically transplant became covered benefits in Oregon. Over the last decade, I've sort of continued these activities. I've worked with the National Marrow Donor Program as chair of their finance committee, working with payers as well as with other hospital administrators of how do we pay for technology. Recognizing the field of cell therapy is growing in the last also several years. I've worked with the ISCT to help reorganize or be part of a commercialization committee effort. And now, again, looking at reimbursement in cell therapies. And again, bringing a clinician's view from the, recognizing pressures and stressors that are dealing with the day-to-day and how that impacts on decision making.
Great. So I'm going to read to you the case study, as I said. Bear with me for about 2 minutes. Just so you know, all the panelists have seen this in advance, so they'll be ready to talk about it, but I think it's important for everybody to just hear, and it's pretty basic. So we're talking about a hypothetical regenerative medicine company called RMC, Inc. They're developing non-embryo donor stem cells to be used in several indications, such as cardiovascular, stroke, and oncology. FDA approval is still pending. Small clinical trials are underway, so early phase clinical trials are underway or have been completed. The early results are promising, but we know that substantially larger and more complex phase 2 and 3 studies are planned, though not yet launched. The FDA has made that clear that that's what they want. Company is trying to decide which indications are most promising at this stage to determine resource needs, allocations. The goal is to launch a product by 2016. Company has 2 products on the market using earlier versions of their stem cell technology. One is a wound care product, which is not an infusion product, but is applied directly on the wound and promotes regeneration of healthy cells, which grow on the stem cell matrix. Clinical use of this product has been positive, though it's an expensive technology, so it's underperformed in the market compared to other wound care therapies because clinicians perceive the medical gain is not worth the extra cost compared to other technologies. Company is trying to decide if further investment is useful or if they should pull the product or perhaps sell or license the rights to another firm. Another product on the market is improves health of patients undergoing kidney dialysis for preventing some side effects. Studies indicate that it might be effective in managing some of the other biological side effects of certain cancer therapies. Given the current bundled payments common in kidney dialysis, the company is also trying to decide if there's sufficient ROI to continue in the Medicare-dominated dialysis market. In addition, the management of the company realizes that reimbursement issues are on the horizon for the other indications currently studied, but they don't yet have a plan to address them because they're not sure which indications are going to be ready for market first, and they have all these other outstanding issues. So management is trying to decide if a common strategy can be developed that would be effective regardless of the indication that ultimately proves most promising, or if they should approach these as individual strategies. No product differentiation exists at this stage of clinical studies on the cardiovascular, oncology, or stroke indications. Clinicians are working in these areas with the same cellular product infused in a consistent manner. Product differentiation as a marketing and payment issue has been discussed, but no action taken yet. Attracting additional investment is critical to the company's future. Obviously, the needs are many. Management is trying to set priorities among these competing needs. The lack of significant success of the two products already on the market is affecting the willingness of investors to make a major commitment. Okay? So I know that was kind of a lot, but wanted to just sort of lay all those facts out there, hypothetical company. So now the panel is going to talk about some of the issues that the company's got to think about or needs to think about when they're thinking about reimbursement and how that affects all the rest of their clinical programs and their business strategy. So first question is, we know that what FDA is looking for in a clinical trial and what a third-party payer, the kind of data third-party payers are looking for, may be different. So what are some of the key distinctions between what an FDA might want to see versus what a third-party payer want to see in terms of clinical data? So I'll start with Teresa.
Wow. So when I was consulting, this was my favorite response. Oh, that's great. It kind of depends, though. It really got me a lot of play in the room. FDA, clearly, I think those in the room have a pretty clear understanding of what the FDA is looking for. There are a lot of interactions with the FDA, and they will lay out for you what it is that they're looking for in the different clinical pathways. And I'll let our other panelists talk a little bit more about that. My expertise really comes with working with the payers. And typically, the answer to that question is, well, it depends. So there's a phrase that's called a payer mix. When you look at a product that you're developing, what is the patient profile and how are they covered by insurers? Are they a Medicare patient? Are they a Medicaid patient? Or are they driven by private insurers? The answer on what those insurers are going to look for is it depends on the insurer. There's also subpopulation questions. For example, is it a diabetic population? And what are the special issues surrounding those patients? But then the next step to that from a payer standpoint that we tend to delve into, and whenever we're looking at particular possible acquisitions or new product development, is, okay, so what are you developing? What is it compared to? And how is that paid? Because if you're not bringing something to the marketplace that has either a clinical story or a commercial story, you're going to be in the position of explaining to the payer why they should continue to pay for your product or pay for your product instead of or as an adjunct in addition to. Additionally, when you're talking to payers, you're talking about a number of different things. You're talking about the framework that already exists. So they're going to look at the product that you're developing and want to put it into their existing framework. How is it coded? Their language? How are they going to decide to process your claims? But specifically how it's covered, not only in comparison to what's already on the marketplace, but what to do with your specific technology. And then there's the end-all, be-all question of how much to pay for it. If you're paying for a cure, very different than if you're paying for a technology that's an adjunct. So again, I go back to that catch-all, which is really the answer is it depends.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It depends a lot on the specifics of the situation. I think one of the interesting things is that we take it for granted, actually, that the FDA knows what it wants to see. I think in general terms, it does. It wants to see safety first and foremost, and then it wants to see a robust demonstration of efficacy through properly constructed, well-designed, adequately controlled clinical trials. The interesting thing is on the third-party payer side of things, given most of them really have not been exposed to, with few exceptions, and there are some really good examples, actually, your product being one of them, that shows tangible clinical benefits and can also demonstrate cost-effective impact, right? And typically, I think third-party payers, they want to see that demonstration of impact within a very finite window. I think in your case, the study that you guys published was an outstanding example of this, where you demonstrated that over an 18-month time frame, that there was a good return on that application of the technology, which is great. Unfortunately, a lot of the examples that we're talking about here, and some of the examples that were described this morning, it may not be so clean cut. So how do you value something if you actually can provide a de facto cure for a disease that could last for a patient for many, many years? I would argue that third-party payers are just absolutely not equipped, most of them, to really contemplate how do we provide adequate reimbursement for something like that, particularly if it's very expensive. Now, the problem that we get into is that if they say you've got to generate a return within the first window, say 12 months, 18 months, or even 24 months, and the therapy is very, very expensive, and the cost of care may actually extend out for many, many years, you may arrive at a conclusion in that kind of a scenario that say it's not worth it to actually pay the cost of that kind of a therapy. But I would say that that analysis is actually incomplete. I think it's interesting. Michael and I recently had the opportunity to sit down with the chief medical officer of one of the biggest third-party payers in the United States. And he was very open and candid about the fact that their thinking with respect to how to value or how to develop reimbursement strategies for these types of therapies is in its nascency. I mean, it is just very early days, and that's because they've never been put in the position of having to think about these types of therapies and how to come up with rational mechanisms that would provide not just coverage, obviously, but reimbursement, which is really the more relevant equation. I can tell you the one thing that we can't afford to do. We can't replicate the Dendreon experience over and over again, where we win the short-term battle of getting a very high reimbursement point, and then the technology is not actually adopted. We have to think about the value that these types of technologies, and it's going to be on an indication-by-indication basis, about the type of impact that they are likely to have. And it's not as simple as what are the avoided costs. So obviously we focus on things like reduced hospitalization, reduced intervention costs for certain things, whether it's stroke or congestive heart failure or some of the other categories that Michael mentioned. It might be relatively easy to define what some of those things are, but it doesn't place an adequate impact on enhanced quality of life, which in some cases may extend out for an extended period of time. And so how do you place a value on that? Do you use the proverbial QALY model, which says a year of life is worth so many dollars? I would argue that there's a lot of studies and a lot of reasons to believe that those types of things are flawed. So I think it's going to depend, but I think ultimately the solution is let's take a look at each indication and look at realistically where are we right now, and let's engage in a dialogue with the third-party payers so that we can say, how are you going to evaluate these types of opportunities, and where can we find common ground so you're not just somewhat interested in seeing these therapies come to reality, but you're actually excited about seeing these therapies come to reality and actually embraced as the new standard of care across the various indications. And I'm sure we'll get into some specific examples during the course of the discussion.
Yeah, so Steve and I sort of love to hear your comments on this, and also, you know, so we have this kind of hypothetical company with some facts. So given that we're not, you know, we sort of know what FDA wants, but it may be different than what, so I'd be curious to hear your perspective. So we can't ask FDA necessarily in this case what they want, but we can ask you as a representative of an organization. What kind of data do you want to see, and how, if you could put your think about yourself and being in Gil's spot as a CEO of a company, so then what would you want to see, and then how do you think a company can use clinical trials that they are thinking about running anyway and need to run? How can they use those trials to get you the data you want?
Okay. Yeah, this is I'm trying to figure out where I start in all of this. I mean, when you're talking about, you know, third-party payers, there's the federal government, the state government, and then there's the commercial payers. So put it in context, the commercial payers aren't the commercial payers. For example, Cigna is a large, we don't even call ourselves an insurance company anymore because we insure so few people. We are health service organizations. We have a number of clients, some of whom are probably your employers, who contract with us, and we manage their benefits. For most of people who have private insurance, the payer is actually their employer. So Cigna is merely an administrator for someone else's benefits. So the good news and bad news is when I'm making decisions, and I have to tell this to clinicians when I talk to them about an adverse determination about coverage, it's not our money that I'm making decisions about. We have no vested interest in approving coverage or not approving coverage, because my job is to do what our client, who's actually going to foot the bill, wants done in their benefit administration, the administration of their benefit package. So they are ultimately the decision makers. So one of the things I like to point out is that in the United States today, healthcare policy, in terms of the evil R word, rationing, is actually being made by the health benefit specialists within 10,000 different companies in the United States. They're the ones who are making the decision, not us. We do give them guidance, though. So we have the MTAC, the Medical Technology Assessment Committee, that makes decisions about should we cover, and particularly for those people where we are the insurer, the 15% of our covered lives, that we are the insurer, should we cover a new technology? And the nice thing is, and it's hard to keep doing this, but we're constantly reminded, we do not consider cost. Cost is not a consideration in determining the keyword medical necessity. Is the new technology medically necessary? And our definition for that is, does it offer a significant therapeutic advantage in a target population over the alternatives? So when we interpret the studies, and what we're doing, the data we're looking at is exactly the same data the FDA is looking at. What we know about a product is what's published. And we only look at published literature. We don't go to the companies and ask them for any additional information. So what we know is what's been published, and we make the assessment based on the conclusions in the literature. Does it offer a significant therapeutic advantage to what currently exists? And we make a decision whether on basis of that, it is medically necessary or not. Then the companies that use us, our clients, the people that come to us, can have the ability, and they do, make another decision, which is, okay, it may be medically necessary, but it's something that we cannot afford and we won't cover it. So the mere fact that it's FDA approved doesn't mean that we think it offers a significant therapeutic advantage within a subset of patients. If we do think it does, the companies that we work for may exclude it from their coverage because it is too expensive. So I'm going to stop.
So cost is an implicit but not explicit consideration with respect to many of these indications.
Correct.
And you're saying it's not, and even to take that one step further, you're saying the cost implication is often from the perspective of the employer as opposed to the perspective of the health plan.
Correct.
With the exception, perhaps, of the covered lives that you have directly.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the cost comes down. It's the last thing that's considered in the implementation of the benefit plan.
So cost isn't considered. What about comparative effectiveness?
That's where the statistical or the significant therapeutic advantage comes in. How do you interpret a significant therapeutic advantage? If something, and the example I use is, if everybody here probably works in a company where you have vendors that come in and they want to sell you a new product or a new service, and the question is, well, does it work? Does it work better than what I'm currently doing? If they convince you that, if they tell you it doesn't work any better than what you're currently doing, your next question is, what does it cost? Can I get the same bang for my buck for fewer bucks? So cost does end up coming in, but you ask all the same questions that we ask. Does it work? How well does it work compared to what I'm currently doing?
So, Richard, you talked about your long history in bone marrow transplantation and working, in this case, with the state of Oregon, obviously public payer. But I imagine that some of the issues are similar in that you had, people had to still use the term evidence-based medicine. So clearly there was an effort to, have the clinical data to demonstrate the value of a treatment regimen or a product, and or the products that go with it, and then. So there was the coverage question, medically necessary and versus other treatments, and then there's the cost implications. So are there lessons we can learn from that? Are there things we can we think of that as a model that we might be able to adopt in the private sector too?
So efficiency is key. And I think I heard that earlier, that the cell therapy will become more efficient, it will become cheaper. So if I think this relates to issues of the Oregon Health Plan. Oregon, you had a Medicaid exemption approved where it was a clinical experiment now about 17 years ago, where rather than reimburse an activity on a DRG Medicare governmental payment is you get one lump of sum for an activity that a central group of individuals will evaluate scenarios, and they figure what is the effort and what's the cost. And they can add different drugs and then pay for these number of days, you get this lump sum payment. And if you're efficient and you get people out of the hospital, you still get a lump sum payment. And it was pretty much across the board. You have a diagnosis, you get this amount paid. What was started in Oregon, which actually helped initiate some of the comparative effective, movement across the country, was a Medicaid system from a state that was poor. And actually that $30 billion deficit that California had, at the same time we had $3 billion deficit a few years ago, a tenth of the population was identical. Not enough money to pay for services. And what they did when they actually said, we're going to pay for health care, they actually wanted to float a line. We're going to identify a set of diagnoses, and we're going to actually identify what can be treated. And if you have a diagnosis that can't be treated, why should I spend a penny on it? And they basically created a rank order, and I think number 762 at the time was the birth of an anencephalic child. There is no long-term benefit by support of anencephalic child, therefore there's no reimbursement. Number one was pneumococcal pneumonia. The amount of money for penicillin or erythromycin was minimal for a huge long-term benefit. Avoiding cardiac toxicity, nephrotoxicity, complications of pneumococcus. So they created a rank order, and they asked to float the value based on how much money was available. They weren't permitted by Congress. They said they can't float the number, there's issues of a disability, the American Disability Act, so what they end up doing is saying, we still have a lump sum numbers. When we talk about governmental, and I think that gets to your private payers, which is how much is your company willing to spend, there's only X number of dollars that are being spent. And the Medicare is a zero sum. At the end of the day, more people coming in, the budget's the same, there's going to be less benefit. Same with Medicaid. Fixed number of budget from your state, and if you have this diagnosis, you get paid. All you can do then to flex it is you can alter the number of people who get it. So what they can do is decrease the number of patients eligible for benefits, and that's what they've done. They have actually looked toward, though, is there a way to, in the world of comparative effectiveness, yes, if you have a therapy that is better, it will move to the top, and better is price, does come into the decision making, is safety, is efficacy. But ultimately, yeah, if you choose to, and again, when I've gone to the Oregon Health Plan to negotiate and lobby on behalf of a disease, their comment back to me is, okay, so what won't we pay for? Because you've got to help me decide what if we pay for yours, what you're not going to pay for. And getting to that point, this is where American medicine is right now. We're moving to, you're hearing about the accountable care organizations or community clinic organizations, groups that will work together. It's now, there will be lump sums to manage a population. We're going to look very effectively at how we make someone live longer with the best possible quality, but price is going to influence decision making at, again, at the business offices. The CFOs of hospitals make these decisions. And I think my last comment in this overview is right now you assume that all medicine is essential. There's actually a list of benefits that are considered essential benefits, and there's a lot of diagnoses that don't make the essential benefits list. The National Marrow Donor Program is trying to bring transplant on the essential benefit list. It is not an essential benefit. We've had multiple patients come to us and die because they can't get a transplant because they don't have appropriate coverage. And no hospital in this country is writing that check to pay for it because it's the right thing to do.
Can we stir the pot a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that did.
It did. So let's take a look at a couple of things that Richard, you raised and you raised as well. So the first is that there are decisions being made right now about who's going to get covered and what benefits are going to get covered. And the one dynamic that's in the backdrop here that we all need to remember is that we've got an unprecedented demographic shift that we're facing now with an aging segment of the population that is going to get dramatically bigger over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years. Specifically, we're going to see about an 80% increase in the number of people over the age of 65. That hits us right in the federal pocketbook because guess who's covering that? It's CMS. We also know we're going to spend about 5 to 7 times as much on annual health care expenses for people that are in that cohort. For one very simple reason, we need to, because we're much more susceptible to things like heart disease and a whole bunch of other things. Now, so you made the comment that from the payer's perspective, or I know we're not calling it, we'll just use that term loosely, you're giving choices to your constituency, and you can say you can either adopt these aspects of what should be reimbursed or what should be covered and reimbursed or is within your plan. The reality of it is we're setting up for a pretty ugly dynamic over the course of the next 20 years or even out beyond that. We've got more need, we've got less physicians, we've got a shrinking resource base, or at least a resource base that's not growing nearly as fast as what we would like it to grow at in terms of being able to keep pace with the unavoidable increase in healthcare expenses. And inevitably that leads to the scenario that Richard was describing, which is it's rationing. Whether or not you want to call it rationing or not, that's the de facto effect, is that we're going to have less to do the things that we want to do, and that's going to affect all of us. And furthermore, as we are looking to expand coverage to cover more people, which I think we all understand that that's exactly where we want to be, that we're in some ways kind of exacerbating the problem. Well, it's interesting. Over the past couple of years, I've had a lot of opportunity, along with Teresa and Michael and others, to spend time in Washington to talk to them about how do we actually think about this problem and how are we going to fix it. And I would argue that the vast majority of people in Washington are looking through the wrong end of the telescope right now. They're thinking about it in terms of cost containment and spending less and trying to press down on any lever that they can press down on to allow us to get more out of the finite resources that we're getting to. In my mind, the answer is really going to only come from one thing, and that's innovation. But innovation will allow us to do more with the limited finite set of resources, but only if we're willing to make a leap that we have not yet been willing to make, in the following sense. Historically, pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies, device companies have been totally unwilling to think about the impact of our new therapies in terms of not just the quality of life benefit, but also what the value proposition is or their ultimate economic benefit. We can't afford to think that way anymore. And I think that the regenerative medicine field as a whole has in some ways an unprecedented opportunity, which is to look at ourselves through a different lens and to say, if we develop these therapies and we can also demonstrate that they are cost effective or more cost effective than the current limitations or the lack of care in many different instances, we could transform medicine as we know it, not just from the clinical impact we can have, but also on the value we deliver to the system. And I would argue that's exactly how we need to be conducting our clinical trials. We need to be engaging with the third-party payers to take a harsh look at those issues and an objective look at those issues so that we can actually not just describe it qualitatively, but actually analyze it quantitatively.
Well, I'd like to just, I'd like to just for everybody to sort of really drill down on that for a second, because if we're, so that we can assume that that's correct, what you said. First of all, the assumptions about where we're heading demographically and all that. But can we drill down on that even more? Like, so when we say we want to, engage the third-party payers, and when you say we want to, really be able to demonstrate that these products can do it. So I'd love to hear from the other panelists on, okay, so specifically, what does that mean, right? So what does that mean? We want to, we need to show this quantitatively. Like what? Or what was an example of when people have done that, where it's been successful, so that we can sort of think about that kind of model?
Well, I'm going to interject here. There's a couple of things when you start hearing comparative effectiveness, or you start looking at this type of technology being implemented to what is an existing infrastructure and an existing system. You have to be very careful with how you approach it. And what I would like to see our industry do is to do exactly that, to lead the charge and be very careful with how we approach it. It's very challenging to say that you're cost effective or that you're going to bend the cost curve when your product hasn't been adapted yet. What we know about life cycles of medications and technologies is they come out and they may not be cost effective. That doesn't mean they're not a good technology. It doesn't mean they're not good for the healthcare system. It means the healthcare system hasn't adapted yet. And when it does, 5 or 10 years out, it may be a cost-effective technology. We've worked in DC trying to have that conversation is let's look at the long game. You're not going to have cost-effectiveness happen in 5 years. So as an industry, one of the things that we need to be looking at is we're going through the phase 1 and the phase 2, and you're looking for what's your commercial message. You also need to be looking at what happens to the healthcare system as an organic entity, and that's all the different payers. It's the physicians, it's the patients. How are they going to adapt to this technology, and how's that going to impact the cost? And that's a very different conversation when you're developing a new technology than just coming out with a pill, for example, and saying, well, we think we can lower cholesterol, we can do something like that over a time frame, whereas you come out with a new technology that may be a cure, as we talked about, and perhaps it has a cost-spend effect over a 2 to 3 year time period. So as an industry, I think we need to kind of step back and change that conversation and be careful with saying we know we're going to be cost effective and really talk about adapting and developing products that over time may impact that curve.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples that currently exists is in hemodialysis for kidney failure and kidney transplant, because of the peculiarities about funding. If you're on dialysis now for 30 months, you immediately go on to Medicare. One of the things that happened is everyone covers kidney transplant as cost effective because studies had demonstrated we knew what the cost was of remaining on dialysis year after year. We knew what the cost was for the kidney transplant. What they were able to calculate was at the increased expenditure on the outlay initially for the kidney transplant, at what point did you save money by keeping people off dialysis? And it turned out that within 3 years, on average, it was cheaper to have done the transplant. So now everyone covers transplant. So related to this, we're now we're at the limits of how many deceased donor transplants we can do. The future is in living donors, so they're looking at ways of doing swaps and what's called kidney pair donation. And we've been approached by people who advocate kidney pair donation as, would we put up our own industry money to help support this because it's good. The more kidney transplants they do, the more we save money. The problem is, and this is the timeline problem that commercial payers have, which is we assume that somebody's going to be with our company, going to remain with Cigna for maybe 2 to 3 years. After that, we assume they're going to be with Aetna or Humana or United. They're going to switch because our clients are looking for the best deal. They're in such financial pressure to provide health care benefits for their employees, and they only have so much money in the company to do that. They're looking for the best deals. So we assume that they're going to switch. So our timeline, our picture that we're looking at, is if we can't recognize a benefit, a financial benefit, within 2 to 3 years, it's hard for us to say we should pay more when the benefit is going to be reaped by United.
Well, there's also the perverse incentive of somebody that's crossing over at age 65 when they're going into Medicare, right?
Exactly.
And so I've actually heard from chief medical officers of various organizations say, hey, if you can provide, if you can treat somebody that has had a stroke and it's at age 64 and you're going to charge us a lot of money for that, we're going to look at that in terms of the window of what's our exposure from the age of 64 to the age of 65, right? So like it or not, there are some perverse incentives and hidden obstacles in this whole dynamic that's been created right now. Now, we can ignore that, and we can say, well, let's focus on the easy cases, right? How can we place a value on curing somebody that's been injured in spinal cord injury or conditions that only affect young people that you may have to carry for an extended period of time? Well, those are the easy demonstrations of how we can reach agreement. But the reality of it is, most of the indications that I think we're thinking about aren't in that realm. They're in the more complicated areas, whether it's things like congestive heart failure or stroke or whatever it may be, in oncology, many indications. And so I guess I would argue that we've got to work together to think about, to create new ways of thinking about this issue and frankly share the risk aspect of it and the cost aspect of it, as well as the distributed benefits of it, because it's going to affect more than just the individual patient. It's going to affect the third-party payer organizations and others, and ultimately it's going to touch all of us. So it's a big problem. There is no easy solution for it, but we've definitely got to start focusing on it right now, because if we ignore it, it's going to hit us in the face in the near term.
So Teresa talked about adoption. So Richard, you're a clinician. Needless to say, adoption of the healthcare system means that clinicians are going to want the product, think it's going to help their patients, want to use the product. So talk a little bit from that perspective about what that means, and from a an industry perspective, kind of how do we sort of align ourselves perhaps with clinicians?
So actually, in a model that actually feeds into the last conversation is autologous transplantation for breast cancer. That actually fits with answering your question too, which is, there's a lot of technology development. There's a lot of data that you see in phase 2 that's suggestive, and then there's a lot of influence, and there's a lot of political influence and advocacy, and basically the transplants for breast cancer industry exploded, and it was based on basically selection bias and putting patients on trials that probably were healthy, and good patients do well. So this became very much in the world of nonprofit hospital care, this became a profit motive. Transplant centers actually tripled their transplant beds because most heme malignancies are orphan diseases. Breast cancer is pretty darn common. And if every woman in the country potentially could be a transplant candidate, that's huge money. And there was in the mid-90s a big financial incentive, and there was no incentive to run a phase 3 randomized trial. Actually, that was a case where I think the clinical investigators got with the payers, because the payers say, we don't have phase, where's the data? And there was the Blue Cross Demonstration Project, which is a randomized trial, to develop phase 3 trials. They would pay for a product, but they also would pay within a financial boundary. You get X amount of dollars. So basically for the non-Medicare patient, you've got a DRG. If you can come within, at that time, $65,000, it was a good investment. So, and it turned out what it turned out, that basically at the end of the day, transplant wasn't any better, it wasn't any worse, it was equivalent to standard of care. At the end of the day, just as many patients died. You maybe had less long-term relapse, but you had higher short-term death. So basically, you actually cheated some women out of 1 or 2 years. End of story, it went away. And that was a collaborative venture that basically was answered, and again, not at the individual level, but when you have a body like ARM, or we have ASBMT, the American Society of Blood and Marrow Transplant, sitting down and try to create an advocacy for clinical trials and doing it right. So that's one. The second thing is, well, how do we work as a physician or clinicians? We do have our rules too. And I think that, and again, using my model of transplant, most major payers in the country created a number. So we heard about, it's all contract. It's what you can do is, whether you accept the risk of the contract. And it was, most of the major payers said, an allogeneic transplant, we will pay $250,000. And we have patients who said, absolutely, I'll take the financial risk. One of our major payer collaborators on this National Marrow Donor program that Steve and I work with, basically they did their analysis, and 18% of their patients always went over. That's not really good financial protection, and there's a lot of indemniture. But they also, what did those patients do? They did what Steve just said. They built in their tab went up, the cost of the procedure went up, and so they basically couldn't wait for their next insurance open time period to get another payer. They're going to drop Cigna, they're going to get Aetna, they're going to get someone else so they can now, someone else resets the clock and starts paying the bills. Medicare is the same. So if you have a product, I think another thing to look at is, are you going to use it inpatient or outpatient? How is its application? Because reimbursement, governmental reimbursement is completely different whether you're in an outpatient setting or an inpatient setting. An inpatient setting, you're going to incorporate the cost of your drug into the reimbursement off of the DRG. And my model, my example is there's a great drug out there for acute leukemia. Trouble is, it's got indication for relapsed leukemia, and the DRG payments for the hospital is like $58,000 approximately. The drug for 1 week administration, the drug itself, the cost to our hospital is 45 grand. I can tell you that never shows up on our hospital formulary. We can't get it. So I think your comments, clinicians are under pressures to also come within and work within the confines. We have to know the rules about how we're being reimbursed, inpatient versus outpatient. And we also have to know that, at the end of the day, if we want to deliver care and our hospital goes broke, the hospital goes under, we don't deliver any care. That has also happened.
Right.
So the practical reality of it is, even though we say we don't consider costs, we do consider costs,
All the
both
time.
at the physician level, at the third-party payer level, and really at every point in the spectrum. So
Totally.
I guess the argument I'm making is, if we're gonna consider costs, why not start considering costs actually when we're kind of in the early stage of clinical development, so we can really gauge how we're going to be held accountable at the end of the day, or at least begin to have the dialogue with the various constituencies that are going to evaluate that. Even if there is language that says we can't explicitly take this into consideration, or we can't explicitly take that into consideration, I guarantee you that even though that language exists, that's exactly how people are thinking about the world. Because one way or another, it's going to get imposed on you, and it's going to get imposed on you, and it's going to get passed on to everybody that you represent, or all your clients or your constituency, depending on how you want to think about it. And I know it's going to impact us, because ultimately we only are successful if we're able to develop those types of therapies. So let me use a kind of an example. So Michael, you pointed to stroke, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, a couple of things earlier. If somebody developed a new therapy to treat congestive heart failure patients, or patients that were at a high risk of congestive heart failure, and you could demonstrate within a relatively short period of time, say 3 years, that the avoided medical costs, the repeat visits to the hospital, all the interventions and everything else, let alone the actual quality of life impact, that those lines cross, okay? Would you look at that through a different lens and say, absolutely, I'd be supportive of something like that, and I'd want to see that technology, if it's safe and if the FDA says it's effective, would I want to see that technology adopted and widely used, because it's going to provide not just clinical impacts, but also a financial benefit, right, to everyone?
Yes, oh, very definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that in the sense that we can actually define those types of instances and get there faster, we're going to see our technologies adopted much more rapidly.
Richard,
And just one other comment on that. Something you alluded to earlier, which I haven't touched on, which I meant to, is we are facing a massive workforce shortage in medicine.
Yeah.
There's not enough physicians, there's not enough nurses, there's not enough nurse practitioners. There's just not enough.
Well, you should lay those numbers out so people understand in terms of the doctors alone over the course of the next few years.
So there's a whole host of reasons, but we're going to be short. But the amount of complexity of care for the elderly is huge. And I think what also people are starting to only look at now is what is the efficiency to the healthcare delivery system. So we're talking about the effectiveness to the patient, whether you can decrease, you say your 3-year outcome, but if I could actually decrease the number of visits, if I could actually decrease the number of hospitalizations, open up hospital beds, that's actually another piece of medicine that people are starting to address, which is how do I decrease utilization with the same endpoint of either quality of life of the individual and survival. But if I work less, that means my effort can be extended to more people.
Yeah.
So the congestive heart failure model is really critical in that case.
Yeah. We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure that if anybody in the audience has a question, they have the opportunity to ask it. So, Sue.
Notwithstanding that the Europeans are probably in no better shape than the Californians or the Oregons, the socialized healthcare system over there intuitively would be more receptive to a longer-term cost-benefit delivery. And I wonder if the industry reps have had any experience in dealing with any of the European payers.
Yeah, Teresa?
Yeah,
you guys
absolutely. I would say that they respond to it more. Quality of life actually plays out a little bit more as well. What I found interesting in the conversations with the payers is very similar to the U.S. Depending on the payers, the 5 major markets, the needs are different, and we're starting to see with a lot of the interaction that we've had, similarly to the different stakeholders within the marketplace. So the physician is looking for one thing, the hospital's looking for another. What are the different stakeholders? What kind of budget impact models do you need versus are they looking for fewer visits? Are they looking for something that's at least comparative that may only work on a subpopulation? So we're seeing a lot of the same dynamics within Europe, and how to answer them, I think, is a similar issue as we have here in the U.S.
Yeah. You know, from a developer perspective, most smaller companies don't have the knowledge, the embedded knowledge to be able to think about these issues from a practical perspective. We need somebody like a Teresa that's actually been through it numerous times. Or we need somebody like Michael who has a firm that basically has gone through this exercise on behalf of I don't know how many different clients you guys have helped kind of. And so I would argue that most companies ignore this as an issue, and I think it's relevant to a lot of companies that are here this week. They ignore it as an issue until it's too late to actually do something about it and actually have the kind of outcome that they want. And that is a big risk factor for all of us because, frankly, it doesn't just affect our development efforts. It affects the flow of capital into the sector in a very big way. If we can demonstrate the kind of value proposition that I am confident we can, it will encourage capital inflow and it will get the third-party payers actually excited. And that's when all the boats really start to rise in a rising tide. And the clinicians, trust me, they'll be supportive of that.
And we talked about this earlier. Phase 1, Phase 2 is not too early to start thinking about.
That's the right time to be thinking about.
Because it's going to drive your commercial model. It's going to derive what clinical information you may need to actually drive some of these conversations. And you don't know without looking at it. You may have a private insurer who has a conversation about, well, they're going to go into Medicare, so why should I care conversation versus you need a longer-term analysis for a private market or for the European market. So Phase 1, Phase 2 is not too early to start understanding who you're going to be selling to and what their issues are. And I would argue as well, we do a lot of this market research, just truly understanding what your market looks like now that you're developing for will help drive that as well.
And that usually starts with Richard, right?
Exactly.
Going right to the clinician and the key opinion leaders and getting their input and saying, how do you think about these types of issues?
And what are your issues? Because
Right.
if your clinical trial isn't designed to address what the payers are concerned about, what they're seeing in that marketplace right now, then you're already behind.
We have time for one more question. I just can't, the light is bright. So if there's somebody there, I can't see it. Okay.
So first of all, fantastic panel. We're talking about a lot. To add some complexity, a lot of us in this room have a product in the bag and we use it across many different indications. At the very best, the value proposition for each one of those indications is somewhat different. You can envision a scenario where payers will pay X for one indication and 4X for another. So I guess a couple of questions. Are the payers prepared for that? What kind of models can we lean on? As companies, how should we be thinking about that when we're lining up our pipelines?
I think that's to you, Stephen.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Richard and I sit on a panel. We're coming up with how do we deal with reimbursement for stem cell therapies. And part of the way that we're starting to look at it differently, at least within Cigna, and I think this will catch on with our competitors. For example, in autologous stem cell procedures, it's become clear to us that we are currently contracting for an episode of care that we call an autologous stem cell transplant. Now, technically, it doesn't meet the definition of the word transplant, which means to move tissue or organ to another location or to another person. This is going back to the same location in the same person. It's really not a transplant. So what we realized is that the stem cell transplants that we're doing for autologous purposes, it's really treatment of an underlying malignancy, and oh, by the way, we also do this stem cell harvest and reinfusion. So we're going to separate those. And I think the same thing's going to happen for allogeneic processes, is we're going to separate out, we're going to deal with the stem cell procedure separately and not call the entire episode of care that we're contracting for based on this one element of the care. So I think what's going to ultimately happen is we're going to say, you want to collect allogeneic stem cells or any other cellular therapy and use them? Have at it. We'll pay you this. We'll pay you not 1x, 4x for different indications. We'll pay you one set fee for these cells, however you choose to use them, and we pay for the rest of the care for that patient separately. So I think that's the model we're going to go to.
Yeah, and if I think I understand the question, you know, a drug is a drug, and whether you use it for treatment of leukemia or use it for treatment of Crohn's disease, you're going to get a charge for that drug. You may be able to capture more based on how it's utilized by more doses. I don't think you can take in, no one's going to pay you 4 times the price in one indication for the same drug that's available otherwise. So I think it's, you know, does that make sense?
It does, although when you start putting the value presentation together, you could potentially for a new product presented different reimbursement. As a company, you think about it, you probably stuck with the lowest common denominator.
Well, order will be important, right? You want to go for, you can't go for your least reimbursable or the lowest reimbursement port indications first, where you're likely to squeeze your ability to actually get to the subsequent indications that you want to go after. So you've really got to think about that from kind of a long-term strategic planning perspective.
So
Yeah, from a practicality standpoint, yeah. So when you launch one product and it's out in the marketplace, or the payers know how much it's going to cost and they have their own tracking systems, if you use it in other indications, you're pretty much stuck to that pricing. Yeah. Where the value proposition comes from is all the stuff that's around that. So the providers that are using it, the hospitals that are using it, and whatever nuances are around providing the care, you have some maneuverability. But from a product standpoint, you're pretty much, once you're in the system, you're in the system. And so to Gil's point, you know, looking at those different indications and what makes the most sense, we do the same thing with Europe. Which market is the most effective market to launch in? And we're looking at pricing because you want to have reference pricing. So it's the same concept.
Yeah, and this has just happened, by the way. Sanofi has purchased alemtuzumab, Campath, which has been a drug which is approved for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. They are now closing their oncology line. They will, right now, if I'm treating a CLO patient, I can get the drug to be given for free because they're closing their line. They are officially closing that indication and relaunching multiple sclerosis, which everyone anticipates the price is going to be escalated because they have a new indication, but they are closing the first indication that they're no longer responsible for. If they kept both indications, they would have to pay at the lower rate.
Right. Well, we can talk about this for hours and hours. And for those of you who are interested, a little commercial here is I encourage you to join the ARM Reimbursement Committee because these are exactly the conversations that we have and the challenges that we're trying to address. As you all heard, there's a lot of challenges for the industry as a whole, for individual companies. Fortunately, we have other stakeholders who are very eager to work with us. And we have terrific technology that's really going to mean a lot to a lot of patients. So it's up to us to make the case in the right way. Please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.